Welcome, everyone. Tonight is the last class in the series that we've called Exploring the Soul. This will be the concluding class. Have we discussed everything there is about the soul? Hardly. Far from it. But we've done hopefully a good overview of different aspects of the soul. And tonight, we're going to follow up. In the last 2 weeks, we concentrated on just one of the powers of the soul, and that was the power of da'at, of knowledge, the sphera of da'at, and choice and free will and decision-making that comes along with da'at. Tonight, we're going to do a similar thing by taking just one of the powers of the soul and trying to develop it more fully. And that is the power of love. Love is the inner dimension of the sphera of chesed. And as we've been teaching, that the powers of the soul are the sphirot. And the garments of the soul are thought, speech, and action. How each one of the powers is expressed in this world. Sometimes by thought, sometimes by speech, sometimes by action, sometimes by all of them simultaneously. So tonight we're going to look at different aspects of not so much love, but love as a power of the soul, and how it's manifest in many, many different ways. So one of the things that Rav Ginsburg teaches is, and that's really why I picked these two svirot more than any of the others of dat and chesed as powers of the soul, because since dat represents choice and free will, and our ability to make decisions. So that's something that goes with us 24/7. And the same thing with love, and maybe on an even greater level. And that is, I'll try to explain that Rav Ginsburg says, we know that from inter-inclusion, all of the sphirot are included in all of the other sphirot. Or in other words, all of the powers of the soul are not one-dimensional, but they're inter-included with other powers of the soul. So Rav Ginsburg said, though, that the power of the soul that is most manifest on all the different levels is chesed and love. It is what he calls the motivating force, the all-inclusive element that is found in every different aspect of the powers of the soul. Now, we can see this in a certain way just through looking at the sphirot. As we've discussed, so that's a message from my son saying we already posted the chart that I will be sharing soon, and we shared it on WhatsApp. So if people already would like to look at it on WhatsApp, that will be we'll call it the second part of the class. We will put it up for everyone here as well. So when we look at the 13 aspects of the sphirot, we've talked many times that even though we talk about 10 sphirot, and we know that when we count keter, we don't count dat, we count dat, we don't count keter. So there's really 11 sphirot, but based on the Zohar, that keter itself has 3 different levels. So one of the great innovations of Rav Ginsburg is more times than not, he deals with all 13 levels of the soul, 3 in keter and counting dat. So that gives us 13. Now, the important thing here is 13 is the gematria of ahava, of love. And it's the gematria of echad, one, unity. So here we see, when we look at the Sefirot in 13 different levels, that it represents not just a oneness of all of the Sefirot together, but that ahava, love, is running through all of it. And we see that from creation. One of the verses about creation is Olam Chesed Yibaneh. A world of Chesed did God create. And along with many different ideas of why God created the world, one of the ones that is always brought is that God is the essence of goodness, is the essence of love and kindness and chesed, and you have to have a recipient for that love. And so God created the world so there would be a recipient, so the essence of God could shine forth. It's one of the ideas. But when we look at the 7 days of creation, we're told that they correspond to the 7 lower Sefirot. The first day of creation is Chesed. The second day is Gevura. Third day is Tiferet, all the ways to Malchut. And we're not going to do it now, but it's really quite amazing when you look at the first day and you look at what's created, and you look at the energy of the day, it represents Chesed. And the second day, I mean, just the fact that there is a creation is God's ongoing chesed to the world. Chesed keil kol hayom. The kindnesses of God are all the day, every moment, every second. And the second day of creation is Gevura. That's when the upper waters and the lower waters were separated. This idea of order and a certain amount of the laws of nature take effect. The third day is Tiferet, which is beauty. That's when vegetation is created, which brings us so much joy in the beauty of nature. The fourth day is the sun and the moon and the stars are placed in their set orbits, and that represents Netzach, the everlasting laws of nature that without them there would be nothing. On the fifth day, the first living beings are created, the fish and the insects and the birds, and this is the glory of God is represented in what's called Nefesh Chaya. We've discussed this in living souls. The sixth day is the land animals and human beings. This is Yesod. And of course, Shabbat is Malchut, is kingship, Malchut. So the first day is Chesed. And Rashi says that everything that would ever be created was already created on the first day. Rashi says this explicitly. And after that, it's just an unfold. In other words, all of the raw materials, spiritually and physically, were already created on the first day. And of course, this is very, very similar to the idea of the Big Bang, that all of physical reality, all of the universe, all of the billions of galaxies, all were contained in that seed that exploded and is still expanding. Everything was there already. Just like in the seed of a tree or a vegetable or a human being, the whole human being is found in potential in the seed. So the first day where everything that would ever be created is the day of Chesed, is the day of Ahava. So that's what Rav Ginsburg means, that of all of the powers of the soul, so it's chesed and love that is the most all-inclusive. Now, along with the 13 sfirot, 13 levels of the sfirot, there's another concept that has 13. Remember, 13 is the numerical value of ahava, love, and echad, oneness. And of course, love and oneness go together. So another concept that also has 13 levels are what's called the 13 midot harachamim, the 13 attributes of compassion. Compassion is very, very close to the idea of love and chesed. And just like the 13 levels of the sfirot, in a certain sense, represent a hishtalshalut, an unfolding of creation from above to below, from the, call it the spiritual, ethereal essence of the light of God that goes through many, many, many yiridot, clarifications and descents until the physical material world. So it's the same thing with the 13 midot harachamim. In Kabbalah, they're called the 13 parts of the beard. Now, this is very symbolic, but what it represents is the beard is in the head, and it represents the flow from above to below. And the 13 midot harachamim are the channels, just like the sfirot are the channels of God's light and energy. The 13 midot harachamim, or in symbolic Kabbalistic language, the 13 parts of the beard are channels through which God's energy comes into the world and maintains the world. Another place where we see this connection with chesed and creation and connected to the powers of the soul is after the, what we'll call it the first account of creation, which ends with Shabbat. So there's what's called the second account of creation, which begins Eila toldot shemayim va'aretz behi baram b'yom asot Hashem Elokim eretz v'shamayim. These are the generations of the creation of heaven and earth on the day that Hashem Elokim, first time in the Torah that both names appear, created earth and heaven. So we're going to look at the word Behi Baram, in their creation. Behi Baram, and there's a small letter Hey in Behi Baram. For those who come to our 70 Faces classes, so we learned about this small Hey in Behi Baram. And our sages tell us that you can take the same letters of Behi Baram and permute them, and it spells out Be-Avraham. And of course, the midah, the attribute, the power of soul most associated with Avram is ahava, is chesed. And so we can read it that these are the generations of heaven and earth through their creation through chesed, on the day that God made earth and heaven. So here, Avram is called the Merkava, the chariot of chesed, the chariot of love. So another very deep connection, which we're gonna touch on, is that on the first day of creation, which we say is chesed, is love, and is the all-encompassing energy of creation. And since human beings, as we've discussed many times, human beings are created in the image of God, so the creative process that we learn about in Bereshit, in Genesis, this is instruction of human creativity. of human beings being in the image of God. So on the first day of creation, the main creation is light. And the word light appears 5 times. And one of the connections brought by different commentators is this relates to the 5 books of Moses, to the Chumash, the 5 books of the Torah, but it also relates to the 5 levels of soul, which we've discussed many times: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida, the 5 levels of the soul. And this is connected to light. So here, there's a very deep connection of light and love. And I think people know that when you experience love, and that's what we're going to do the second part of the class and see how many different variations and expressions of love there are. But when we feel love, we feel light. We experience light. So this is connected to a beautiful acronym that Rav Ginsburg gives over, that Ahava, those 4 letters, Aleph and Hey, and Bet and Hey, excuse me, is an acronym for Or HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the light of the Holy One, blessed be He. The Aleph is Or, the Hey is HaKadosh, the Bet is Baruch, and the final Hey is Hu. Or HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the acronym of Ahava. And this we see on the first day of creation, where the first creation is light, but we've identified the first day of creation with God's chesed. And since everything that would ever be created in the physical world and the spiritual world is a manifestation of God's love and chesed, so this influenced the human soul, this connection of love being the motivating force of the soul in all the sefirot. So this is very, very important ideas. Now there's one more idea, and this is that at the end of the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, the Torah recounts 42 different places where we camped in the desert during the 40 years. And there's much symbolism about this and much to say. The Baal Shem Tov taught that this is symbolic of the journey that every person takes in this world. Of course, everyone's journey is different, but the symbolic idea of 42 stops and encampments in the desert is connected to each person's journey through this world. So Rav Ginsburg points out an amazing thing, that the root word of love, Aleph, Hey, Bet, in different forms, in different tenses, appears exactly 42 times. And in one of his books, he actually goes to all 42 times that the root word of love appears in the Chumash. And he just makes a simple and deep connection that all of the journeys in the desert is in the context of God's love. Just like the journey of the soul in this world is an expression of God's love for each and every one of us. So these are very, very beautiful ideas. And the last idea before we get to the chart that I'm going to share is that we said there's a deep connection between light and love. And one of the many places that this is manifest, excuse me, is in Shabbat. Now we know that we begin every Shabbat, especially women who light candles, and with this motion bring infinite light into the physical world, because that's what Shabbat is. We're told that the infinite light of God of the first day of creation was hidden away. And so they asked, well, where was it hidden? So different people answer different ways, but most answer in the Torah, in Shabbat, in the menorah, in the Chanukiah. So when someone learns Torah on a deep level, we are connecting to the infinite light of God. And the same thing with Shabbat. When we experience Shabbat in the deepest way, we are connecting to the infinite light of God. Now we see this in a beautiful mirror image, because the numerical value for Shabbat is 702. And those numbers reversed, 207, which is the inverse of 702, is light. Light is 207, or, but it's also the same gematria, 207, of Ein Sof. So here we have light and Shabbat really go together. We bring in Shabbat with light, we usher out Shabbat with light. And the whole experience of the soul on Shabbat is 1/60th of the world to come, of the infinite light. But there's a midrash that says, God says to the Jewish people, I have a very, very special gift that I keep in my most hidden treasury, and Shabbat is its name. So here, the fact that God gave us Shabbat is an expression of God's love for the Jewish people, and hopefully, ultimately, for the whole world. As Reb Shlomo used to sing, the whole world is waiting to sing the song of Shabbat. And Bezrat Hashem, when Mashiach comes, there will be an experience of Shabbat that the whole world can share. Okay, so that is our introduction to light. And now what I want to do is I'm going to share a chart with you that is from Rav Ginsburg. And it is going to show 13 different relationships of love. So here I'm going to okay. Can someone indicate that you see the chart? Because remember we had a problem last week. I'm going to look really quickly. Yes, we see it. Okay. I am very happy about that. Okay, so what we're looking at is called the 13 types of love. There's so much that can be said about this. With the time that we're given, I'm going to try to go through this. So first of all, we see that these, the small print is the name of the sphera. And each of the sphera represent a different relationship of love. And so the idea here, first of all, is the idea that we learn all the time called inter-inclusion, where if we talk about love, well, that's a very general concept. And if we talk about relationships of love, so because of modern culture most people, if you say the word love, most people think of love between a man and a woman, marital harmony, falling in love. But here we see that there's many, many different manifestations of love. They're all important. Each one is important in its own way. So we're going to go through it relatively quickly. But first, I want to go through I guess it's the right-hand column on the chart. And this talks about 4 basic types of love. This is a very important teaching that Rav Ginsburg gives over very often. And if we start at the top, in Hebrew, it's called Atsumi, self-reflective love. And this is what's called the love of God. Why is it called self-reflective? Because since we are created in the image of God and we are animated, we all have a spark of God. So our love of God in a way is very connected to self-love. And self-love is very connected to love of God. The next one is an intellectual type of love. And this is called muskal, from the word seichel. And this is represented by love of Torah. As we're going to see, each one of these has relationships that we will discuss in a minute. So we start with the love of God, and then it's the love of Torah. This is an intellectual type of God. The first one, the Atsumi, comes from the essence of the soul, comes from the absolute essence of the soul. Here, this is coming from the intellect, our love of God. The next one is an emotional type of love. This is called murgash, from the word regesh, which means feeling, emotions, feelings. And this is the love of Israel. And then the next one is called a more innate or behavioristic kind of love. And this is called the love of the land of Israel. And then when we get down to Malchut, so even though Keter is the highest of the Sfirot and Malchut is the lowest, we always put them together because what does a king wear? A crown. Keter Malchut, the crown of kingship. So here again, we have what's called self-reflective. And this is also love of God, and we'll see how that is manifest. So again, the 4 types of love that we're going to, in a sense, expand to 13 relationships are the love of God, the love of Torah, the love of Israel, and the love of the land of Israel. So now we're going to start at the top in what's called Pnimiyut of Keter, the inner aspect of Keter, which is called straight light. And this is the love of God to Israel. In other words, the highest level of Keter is God's love of Israel, and by extension, for all humanity, for the whole world. But here in relationship, we're relating it to the love of God to Israel. And then what's called chitzoniot of Keter, the outside of Keter, which is called the returning light. The straight light is God's love, is, as it were, coming down into the world, coming down to Israel, coming down to the soul. And the love of Israel for God is what's called returning light, through our prayer and doing mitzvot and doing good deeds. That is returning our love to God. That's what we call returning light. So here in what's called the Atsumi, the self-reflective type of love, So this is the love of God to Israel and the love of Israel to God. Now this is expressed in the most poetic way in the Song of Songs. In the Song of Songs, we learn that the whole song is an allegory of this love of God to Israel and Israel to God. So now let's go to the intellectual type of love, which is reflected in love of Torah. And here we see three different relationships. In Chachma, wisdom, this is the love of the teacher to his or her students. In Bina, this is the love of the students to their teacher. And in Dat, this is the love between the students of a particular teacher or Rebbe or Rabbi or Rebbitzin, the unity of the students. So this is how love of Torah and intellectual love is represented in relationships. Now, these three relationships are so critical and such a part of Judaism. But for many, many, many people in the world, this is a missing aspect of people's lives. In other words, a lot of people, once they're through with school, and for most people, everyone has their favorite teacher along the way, or a teacher that made a big impression, had a great influence. And these are really important. But a lot of people, I would say that most people in the world, once you finish school, college, whatever, there's no longer this relationship. In Judaism, it's absolutely critical to continue to have a Rav, to have a mentor, to have a teacher. And the type of love here that we're talking about is very, very similar to a soulmate kind of connection. Because if one has a Rav or a Rebbe, this is a lifetime commitment. And it's on the side of the Rebbe or teacher as well. It's not like just people come to classes and then there's no relationship, there's no continuity. But throughout Jewish history, throughout Jewish tradition, there's this constant emphasis on the importance of these kind of relationships, of the teacher to the student to the teacher, and among the students themselves. And the Ari once made a statement that one of the reasons that Mashiach is not coming is because there's not sufficient dibuk chavirim. Dibuk chavirim means students that love each other. We know the whole story of the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva. Whatever their lacking was, there was some honor or love or feeling of unity that was lacking between them. So this is also a very, very important thing. In Hasidic tradition, the idea of what's called a hitva'adut, of a verbringen, is so important because this is when the Rebbe and the students get together, and the atmosphere is one of creating unity, of singing together, sometimes making l'chaims together, dancing together, listening to the teacher and absorbing it all together. So that's the importance of hitvadut, of the unity of the students with their teacher. So the Talmud is full of stories for the good and the not so good about these relationships. Many, many stories when this kind of relationship was not fulfilled in the proper way, and other many, many stories of the beauty and the clinging between student and teacher. And as I said, in ideally, these are lifetime relationships. In fact, in one place in the Gemara, it says that a student doesn't really understand completely the teachings of their Rabbi till 40 years. In other words, it takes 40 years of a deep love relationship for finally the student to really be able to absorb what what their Rabbi is teaching them. Okay, next we'll go to what's called murgash, the emotional type of love. And this is called the love of Israel. And what's interesting here is that in Chesed, the love of a man for a woman in a husband and wife relationship is in the context of the love of Israel. Because really to build what's called a bayit ne'aman, a faithful house, a house full of faith, well, it's all within the context of Judaism, of keeping the Torah. And as we know from both Hillel Zaken and Rabbi Akiva, that love is the great principle of the Torah, or the whole Torah. So the love of husband for wife, which is an emotional type of love, it can be intellectual as well, and it can be innate, but it's in the category of a fiery type of love. So this is chesed, and the love of a woman and to her husband is on the side of gevura. Remember, the right-hand side of the sphere always represents the masculine energy, and the left side, the feminine. So that's why we have here, and that's why the teacher is on the side of the masculine, and the student is on the side of the receiver, of the feminine. But we also know a famous expression is more than I've learned from my teachers, I've learned from my contemporaries, and more from my contemporaries is what I've learned from my students. So the giver and the receiver, it's not always black and white. It's not always black and white. So the next one we're going to go to is the parents and children. Well, in most cases, it's the parents teaching the children, but we all know how much we learn from our children, how many times that they actually become the teachers. And here in Tiferet, so the love of husband to wife is chesed. The love of wife to husband is gevura. And in Tiferet is the love between friends. So you see that this comes right below the unity of students, this idea. And this is also very, very connected. We all know how important friends are. And, even though we always say blood is thicker than water, that family comes first. But we all know in society today where parents and children and grandparents don't necessarily live together anymore. Sometimes it's thousands of miles away. Sometimes it's a few cities away. Sometimes it's halfway around the world. And then friends become, in a sense, like family. Because even though family really does come first, but sometimes when family is not there, our friends become our family. So that's on the level of Tiferet. And then we go down to the Mutba, the innate types of love. And this is the love of the land of Israel. And here there are three relationships, is the love of parents to children is a netzach, because this really is an everlasting relationship. That's why in the laws of mourning, there's 7 close people that we do an actual full mourning for. But the only one that, we'll call that a partial mourning. The only one which is what we'll call full, a full year of mourning, is children to parents. Because this is a netzach kind of relationship. So this is the love of parents to children. And every parent knows it doesn't matter how old you are and how old your children are. When parents are, let's say, in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and their children are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're still their children. It doesn't matter how old your child is. Your child is always your child. And your parent is always your parent. On the side of Hod, so this is the love of children to parents. And we're told that Netzach and Hod always go together. So this is that's what it's called, an innate kind of love. It's in our DNA, it's in our blood. The other relations that we've talked about are super important, but here we're talking about an innate type of love. And of course, the one in the middle is the love between siblings. We have parents and children, children and parents, and then the love between siblings. And we know from the Torah how challenging sometimes that is. There's so many cases in the Torah of sibling rivalries. But when it works is Hine matov uman naim shevet achim gam yachad. How good and how pleasant it is when brothers and sisters can sit in peace. And the last love is a reflection of the highest love. Again, it's called Atsumi. And this is in Malchut, because Keter and Malchut, even though they're the opposites, above and below, that's why we say the end is wedged in the beginning and the beginning in the end. So this type of love of God, so this is reflected in the love of the king to his people. Now this relates to God as king. 100 times a day we say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, that we refer to God and relate to God constantly, 100 times a day as the king, our king. But it's also a human king, because we're told that ideally, at least, we know from the Tanakh how many not so good kings there were. But there are also many, many good kings. And the king, just like the Kohen is the representative of God to the people, and the representative of the people to God, so the same thing with the king. The king, ideally, is the representative of God to the Jewish people, and the also the representative of the people to God. So on what's called the Panemius of Malchut, the inner aspect of Malchut is the love of the king to his people. And on the outside of Malchut, the returning light, is the love of the people to their king. So with this, we've completed this this chart. It's a very, very instructive chart because love is so all-inclusive. This just helps us see a broader picture of the different types of love in our life. And we could use it very much as a means of introspection to like do a checklist of kind of like during Sfira to Omer, where we're trying to improve ourselves, or during Elul and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we're trying to make ourselves better. It could be like a checklist of each one of these loves. We could ask ourselves, am I fulfilling to the most complete degree how I could express these types of love in my life to God, my love of Torah, my love of teachers, my love of fellow students, husband and wife, wife to husband, friends, parents, children, siblings. All of these different ones were not perfect. And we all know that some of these relationships are not always smooth and not always easy. Nonetheless, this is a good holistic way to look at love, going through 13 levels. There are 13 different relationships mentioned here, and that represents love. So with this, we are going to conclude our mini series of exploring the soul. And I'll just end with a blessing. I'll just end with a blessing that, first of all, we all realize the deep meaning of being created in the image of God, and that we understand the incredible power and opportunity of the soul in this world, in our bodies, in this journey through life, that we appreciate the opportunity to express ourselves in thought, speech, and action, and to take our potential, take the powers of the soul, and to try to express them and activate them and fulfill them to the greatest degree.